There are moments when you discover that the life you thought was private was being watched, recorded, analyzed by people you never saw or suspected. In a basement archive marked for destruction, a file surfaced that should have been burned decades ago, and it contained names, faces, intimate details of ordinary lives. This is not conspiracy theory or paranoid speculation. This is documented reality, a program so invasive it monitored the psychological states of civilians without consent or disclosure. What you're about to learn will change how you think about privacy, about the invisible eyes that have always been watching from behind bureaucratic classifications. The file exists, partially declassified, heavily redacted, but what remains visible is enough to prove that for years they were inside people's minds without permission. In 1953, at the height of Cold War paranoia, a covert program began that would track and psychologically profile thousands of American citizens for decades. It wasn't about suspected spies or political dissidents. It was about ordinary people, teachers and factory workers and students, anyone who fit certain behavioral criteria. The criteria themselves were classified, but the files reveal patterns. People who read specific books, attended certain gatherings, expressed doubts about official narratives publicly. They were placed under what the documents call continuous psychological observation, a clinical term for something far more disturbing when you understand what it meant. Surveillance teams would document their routines, their relationships, their emotional responses to manufactured situations designed to test loyalty and psychological stability under pressure. The subjects never knew they were being watched, never consented to become case studies, never understood why certain people kept appearing in their lives, asking questions. You might recognize this feeling, the sense that someone knows too much about you, that conversations feel scripted, that coincidences happen too frequently to be random. For the people in these files, that feeling wasn't paranoia, it was reality. They were living inside an experiment designed to map the architecture of civilian psychology. The program was called Project Watchful Eye, though that name appears only 3 times in the declassified portions, always heavily redacted around any operational details. What we know comes from marginal notes, from bureaucratic slip-ups where classifications were applied inconsistently, from the few pages released after decades of legal pressure. One file belonged to a woman named Margaret, a librarian in Ohio who had the misfortune of checking out books on Soviet history during the McCarthy era. Her file began with library records, then expanded to include her shopping habits, her correspondence, detailed notes on her emotional state, observed through staged interactions. Agents posing as friends would ask loaded questions, record her responses, analyze her word choices for signs of ideological vulnerability or susceptibility to foreign influence. She lived under this surveillance for 7 years without knowing. 7 years of her life documented in clinical language that stripped away her humanity and dignity. When she finally learned about it decades later through a Freedom of Information request, she was 81 years old, and the knowledge shattered her remaining years. She spent her final months questioning every friendship, every conversation, every memory, wondering what had been real and what had been performance designed to test her. This is what surveillance does when it remains hidden. It doesn't just invade privacy, it retroactively poisons every moment that came before the revelation finally arrives. The psychological assessments in these files are disturbing in their detachment, describing human beings as subjects exhibiting responses rather than people living their lives. One entry notes that Subject M displays appropriate anxiety response when confronted with authority, suggesting successful internalization of social compliance mechanisms and behavioral control. This was Margaret being stopped by a police officer for a taillight that had been deliberately broken by the surveillance team the night before to create the test. Her fear, her apologetic cooperation, her nervousness were all documented as data points in an assessment of her psychological conditioning under state authority structures. She was not a citizen being served by her government. She was a specimen being studied by researchers who saw her inner life as territory to map. If you're feeling disturbed by this, if you're starting to wonder what other programs might still be running in the shadows, you're not alone in that realization. Consider subscribing to stay informed as we continue uncovering the documented truths that challenge everything we've been told about freedom and privacy in democratic societies. The program expanded through the 1960s, growing from a few hundred subjects to thousands, all carefully selected based on algorithms that predicted ideological susceptibility. The algorithms were crude by modern standards, but effective. They identified people who asked questions, who read widely, who seemed intellectually curious about alternatives to consensus. In other words, they targeted the very people a healthy democracy should encourage, the ones who think critically and refuse to accept narratives without examination. This wasn't about protecting national security. This was about mapping and managing the psychological landscape of dissent before it could organize into movements or resistance. The files contain detailed psychological profiles written by credentialed psychiatrists who violated every ethical standard of their profession in service of classified state objectives. These weren't rogue operators acting without authorization. This was institutional, approved at the highest levels, funded through black budgets that never appeared in public records. The paper trail shows sign-offs from cabinet-level officials, suggesting that the surveillance and psychological manipulation of civilians was considered routine government business for decades. One memo from 1962 discusses the cost-effectiveness of psychological monitoring versus traditional surveillance, praising its ability to predict behavior before it becomes problematic. The language is economic, calculating return on investment for different methods of population management, as if citizens were products to be quality controlled for compliance. Another document outlines plans to expand the program internationally, to share psychological profiling techniques with allied intelligence services for use on their own populations. This wasn't just an American program. It was a framework for psychological surveillance that spread through NATO countries, each adapting the methods to local conditions. The declassified files from Britain, released years later, confirm parallel programs with different names but identical methodologies for monitoring civilians without legal authority or oversight. In Canada, in Australia, in West Germany, similar files exist, partially released, heavily redacted, all telling the same story of states watching their own people obsessively. The subjects of these programs lived normal lives on the surface, but beneath that normalcy, their psychological states were being charted like weather systems by unseen analysts. Some of them experienced what the files call induced anxiety episodes, situations deliberately created to destabilize their emotional equilibrium and observe their coping mechanisms under stress. A man would lose his job through covert interference, then be monitored to see how he responded, whether he blamed himself or recognized external manipulation of events. A woman would have her mail delayed, her phone calls disrupted. Small, persistent problems designed to test her threshold for frustration and her ability to detect systematic interference. These were not hypothetical scenarios. These were real lives being deliberately destabilized in the name of psychological research conducted without consent or accountability to anyone. The people who designed these experiments were educated professionals, psychologists, and psychiatrists who had taken oaths to do no harm, but who justified harm as service. They convinced themselves that the knowledge gained from manipulating unwitting subjects was valuable enough to override individual rights to autonomy and informed consent always. This is how atrocity becomes routine, through professional language that distances the actor from the human consequences of actions taken in the name of larger objectives. The files contain no expressions of doubt, no ethical hesitation, only clinical observations and recommendations for refining techniques to make future interventions more effective. One researcher notes that subject resistance to induced stress can be overcome through prolonged application of low-level disruptions rather than acute traumatic events that might trigger awareness. This meant that instead of one obvious crisis, subjects would face years of small problems, each individually explainable, collectively designed to erode psychological stability gradually over time. The cruelty of this approach is in its deniability. The subject can never point to a single moment of violation, only a vague sense that life is harder than it should be. Margaret described it perfectly in an interview before she died. saying she always felt like she was swimming upstream while everyone else seemed to glide effortlessly through existence. She thought it was her failure, her inadequacy, her inability to cope with normal life, never suspecting that normal life had been deliberately made abnormal for her specifically. This is psychological torture that leaves no visible scars, no evidence that would stand up in court, only a lifetime of accumulated doubt and diminished selfhood. The program officially ended in 1973, according to the Declassified summary, but the files suggest continuity under different administrative classifications and operational names afterward. References appear to ongoing monitoring activities, to subject databases being transferred rather than destroyed, to techniques being refined rather than abandoned when scrutiny intensified temporarily. The 1970s investigations into intelligence abuses touched the surface of these programs, but never penetrated to their core, never forced complete disclosure or accountability. Key files were destroyed before they could be subpoenaed. Witnesses developed convenient memory failures. Classification rules were tightened to prevent future disclosures from emerging easily. What we have now are fragments, pieces of a larger picture that was deliberately shattered to prevent anyone from seeing the whole truth of what was done. And those fragments are enough to prove that for decades, psychological surveillance and manipulation of civilians was considered acceptable by the institutions meant to protect them. The question is not whether it happened. The documents prove it happened. The question is, what happened next? What evolved from these programs in the digital age? The techniques documented in these files are primitive compared to what technology now makes possible. The psychological profiling that required teams of analysts then can be automated now. Every search you conduct, every article you read, every pause in your scrolling creates data that maps your psychological state more accurately than any Cold War observer could. The surveillance is no longer limited to selected subjects. It's universal, continuous, and far more sophisticated in its ability to predict and influence behavior at scale. The consent we never gave then is still not being asked for now. It's simply assumed, buried in terms of service, that no one reads and couldn't refuse anyway. We are all Margaret now, all living under observation that maps our inner lives, all subject to experiments in manipulation that we cannot see or prove individually. The difference is that we're carrying the surveillance devices ourselves, feeding the systems voluntarily with every click, every purchase, every moment of our digitally mediated existence. The files from Project Watchful Eye are a warning from the past about what power does when it can watch without being watched, when it faces no accountability. They show us that the impulse to surveil, to control, to manage populations through psychological manipulation is not new. Only the scale and efficiency have changed over decades. Margaret's file was closed when she died, marked as terminated subject. One more life reduced to a case number in an archive that was never meant to see light. But her story matters because it proves that the paranoid feeling that someone is watching you, analyzing you, might not be paranoia at all, but perception. It matters because it reveals the gap between what we're told about privacy and freedom and what actually happens behind classifications that protect power from scrutiny. It matters because somewhere right now, new files are being compiled, new profiles are being built, new experiments are being conducted on populations that don't know their subjects. The technology has changed, the scale has expanded, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same. Those with power watching those without, studying them, managing them, controlling behavioral outcomes. We live in the world that Project Watchful Eye helped create, a world where surveillance is normalized, where privacy is nostalgic, where consent is a fiction we maintain for comfort. The files are available, you can request them, you can read the redacted pages and see for yourself what was done to people whose only crime was thinking independently. You can see the bureaucratic language that made horror routine, the professional credentials that gave torture legitimacy, the classifications that kept it hidden for generations from exposure. And then you have to decide what it means that this happened, that it was never fully addressed, that the systems that enabled it were never truly dismantled afterward. You have to decide whether to believe that such programs ended or simply evolved, whether the reassurances about oversight and accountability are real or performance for public consumption. The answer is written in every device that tracks your location, every algorithm that predicts your desires, every system that knows you better than you know yourself now. Margaret died without justice, without acknowledgement, without apology from the people who stole years of her life and poisoned her memories with retroactive suspicion about everything. She is owed at least the dignity of being remembered, of having her story told, of serving as a reminder of what governments do when they believe no one is watching. What would you do if you discovered that your life had been monitored, that your private moments had been analyzed, that your psychology had been mapped without consent?